Hello, and welcome to the Heartwin Building Sustainability Podcast. This is episode number six, I think.
We can count to high numbers.
Episode number 6. So this podcast is chats with people who are doing sustainability in the built environment. Sort of dreamers, doers, designers.
Makers, yeah.
This month's podcast is with Noel Isherwood, and Noel is an architect, and we talk mostly in this, or largely in this podcast, about his time when he was working at Poundbury. He was a spokesperson, I think, for Poundbury. Do you know about Poundbury?
Yeah, only little bits and pieces, but really interesting. I've never actually had a chance to visit, but as far as I know, Poundbury is a recent addition to Dorchester, and was
planned expansion.
Yeah, so it was one of the many towns in the UK that needed to grow, and as most towns do, they can grow quite unsustainably. They just kind of keep bulging out of the sides and adding more and more stuff. Yeah, that's not very people focused. And good old Prince Charles, your old mate,
had
a different idea.
Yeah. Do we need to talk about how he's my mate?
Probably should introduce that.
Okay.
I think.
So, he's probably the top person on my list. When I wrote a list of people I wanted to interview, Prince Charles was at the top.
And why was that?
He's kind of interesting. I mean, he's very interesting, I guess. I'm not in any way a royalist, or I don't think I'm anti them, but I don't.
Yeah,
it's
not. We're not approaching it from a kind of sycophantic royal worship situation. It's very much his deeds and actions that have brought him to our attention, isn't it?
Yeah. So he's been chatting about sort of community and organic food. The Duchy farm has been growing organic food for years, and people wrote him off as a lunatic, and he's just lost his mind. And then that's sort of 30 odd years ago, and now suddenly everyone's caught up and gone like, oh, actually these things are bad.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess it's because he probably has a lot of time to think.
Yeah, pretty healthy disposable income, doesn't it?
He is one of the biggest landowners, I guess. So he's sort of fairly connected. But so he's had all these what were deemed wacky ideas, and then he sort of stuck with them and not let anyone tell him no. And then years later we're kind of agreeing.
Yeah.
But he set up a thing called the Prince's Foundation, which is all about heritage skills, not letting heritage skills die, and kind of aiming to develop people's craft skills from sort of, being good up to a sort of master craftsman sort of standard.
Yeah.
And that is a program that I went on 2015, maybe. And I was their first and I believe only ever earth builder that went on there. They didn't really know what to do with me, I don't think.
Stones are in the earth.
Yeah.
Do stones.
That's exactly what they said, actually.
Trees grow out of the earth. Do trees.
And so they offer this 8-month program where as a craftsperson you go along and you work with these incredible people. You work on a project, or I worked on a project up at Dumfries House, building a heritage ducat, which is the Scottish word for a dovecote. So it was all reclaimed stone, lime mortars, beautiful timber framing. I designed a really smashing floor.
You did, I saw it.
So I'm from that point of view, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, and it's a kind of natural bedfellow for the stuff that we're doing through Heartwin, and in that we're very keen on the kind of the heritage skills and crafts. We think that, sustainable design is rooted in traditional vernacular heritage construction.
Yeah.
And what he's doing both with the Prince's Foundation and with things like Poundbury was acknowledging that fact and trying to bring it into kind of a modern design language. And apply it to various different areas. I think he's pretty visionary, even if he's got a little bit of an odd character.
Is he an odd character?
I think so. I think that people haven't taken him seriously, and I think it's potentially because of the royalness.
So yes, this conversation focuses mostly. It was kind of drawn back at many points to Poundbury and Noel's time there. Yeah, but what we haven't spoken about is where we're at.
Yeah.
Like the Heartwind build, summer 2019 build is, well, we a month in?
Yeah, we're quarter of the way through.
End of this week will be a month in.
Yep. Storming through it. It's going amazingly.
Yeah.
It's really, really turning into something now.
Yeah, so in today, we put up all of the roof trusses.
Yep, got some of the ridge boards in.
Tomorrow it's going to be rafters. And our team of students is working incredibly well. So just to backtrack a little bit, we run a build every summer.
Yep.
And we take on a team of 10 students, and they are with us learning all the skills from the foundations right through to the finishes. And yeah, at the moment they're learning timber framing. So a kind of combination of conventional stick framing, so using dimension timbers. We've got a bit of oak framing, and we've got some roundwood timber framing in there as well.
Yeah, and beautiful chestnut. Yeah, it's going well. So they've completed all of the lovely reclaimed bricks with their lime mortar, which they did a fantastic job on. I think I've seen some of the best walls going up, and much better than a lot of the walls I've seen on conventional building sites. So we were really proud of the quality of work they've been putting in. And then to see the timber frame spring out of the ground so quickly and accurately, it's fantastic. It's a real thing.
It really is.
Yeah.
So yeah, in the coming weeks, we've got a metal steel roof.
Yep.
Going on, and then straw bales come in, and they become our insulation and our wall system.
Yeah, we've got a load of foam glass coming in for the floors, and we get to do our subfloor, rammed earth subfloor.
Yeah, so rammed earth floor, and then clay plasters, lime renders, I should say.
Yeah, lots going on. Team's doing a fantastic job, and they've really gelled together well as a little weird family, which is what we always love to see. Yeah, it's great.
So I think that's enough chat from us. We will check in back at the end, just with a bit more stuff. So, Noel, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yes, we are, we're in the, I keep wanting to call it the Sustainability Centre, but it's the Environmental Centre in Swansea.
Swansea Environment Centre.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And what is that exactly?
Well, it was set up over 20 years ago, and it was designed to really educate people into the new thinking behind sustainable issues that were only then just sort of emerging as like quite important things that we need to get to grips with. And so it was done as just a sort of focal point for people in Swansea to come and understand a little bit what is climate change and what is renewable energy. I mean, it was really basic in that way, you know.
So when was it set up?
Well, I don't know exactly the date, but
in what sort of year?
It must have been about in the sort of probably early 90s, I would say.
Okay.
So, something like that.
Yeah.
But if you go to the entrance, you'll see a picture of Prince Charles actually opening the opening the centre, which when he was quite young, you know, looks quite fresh and and everything. And so there is always this link with sustainability and the royal family. However it happens, it comes with him in particular. And So as the Prince of Wales, I suppose he was establishing his position in Wales at that time.
Yeah.
So Swansea's always had this kind of there's a side to it which is very about activism and trying to do things differently, and there's always been like hippie communities sort of along the Gower and people living very differently. and shocking people from time to time. And at the same time, there's a very sort of conservative centre and sort of politics that happens in most provincial towns as well going on at the same time. So there's sometimes a little bit of a conflict between the two and misunderstanding or non-communication,
yes.
Whatever.
Nice. And then has this place, I've seen outside that there's a whole sort of raft of different people working here, and there's a cafe and lots of information and stuff like that.
Yes, well, they like doing campaigns. So at the moment, there's a campaign, a plastic-free campaign for Swansea, to try and get people aware of the amount of wrapping and plastic and cling film that's just sort of being produced on a massive scale through all the main supermarkets. And while there are some attempts to try and change that, it's still an issue. So the actual centre here, with their little cafe and a little shop that they've developed, is selling non-plastic wrapped products. So you can buy pulses and lentils and rice and brown rice and stuff all in paper bags, and it's a sort of it's a small way of trying to get people engaged with that whole concept, and renewable or more ecological washing powders, washing liquids that you can actually come and fill up your liquid container here without having to keep buying new plastic ones.
It's it's the way. I mean, I lived in North America for a long time, and the bulk buy bins were just a sort of standard way of shopping. So it's really sort of surprising to me that we've taken so long to, like, that's a new and novel idea.
It has taken us quite a long time to catch up. That's why I guess people who were talking about it 20 or 20 more years ago were seen as like really out there and a bit weird and activist and that hasn't completely gone away. I mean, it's still, unfortunately, you're a bit of an outside voice when you're talking about these things, which
very much so, yeah.
And obviously, the work that you're doing is taking building, in that same direction, trying to look at natural materials. And as an architect with my practice here at the Environment Centre, it's useful for me to be here because I get to speak to people who have those general interests to move things. And obviously, you can't always move it 100% in the direction that you would ideally like it to be. But if you can make percentage improvements on every project you do and the thinking of every client, then you are making some changes.
Yes, I find it quite difficult when that we're in this bubble of, I'm talking to you and you've got an understanding of what I'm talking about with natural materials, and the people I teach and the sort of circles I move in. It's not in any way a new idea or an extreme idea. And then I'll meet someone at a wedding or something, and they'll just go, "What? You can't do that. What are you talking about?" And it's this completely alien idea. Yeah, it's a funny thing to be a sort of quite a niche. But hopefully if we keep going, then it won't be niche, and it'll just be we won't call it natural building, we'll call it building, and that'll be
that will be the mainstream by then, isn't it? Yeah.
That's the hope.
Yeah. Well, that requires a lot of campaigning, and the Environment Centre draws together quite a lot of sustainable organisations, like Low Carbon Swansea Bay being one of them. And Renew Wales has had its base here as well, does have its base here, and they're involved in sort of getting alongside different organisations and groups who are thinking that they want to do some changes, and maybe they should be doing it in a more green and environmentally friendly way. So they can bring mentors, through Welsh Government funding or lottery funding, I think, into play, and enable conversations to happen within sort of community groups or church committees or whoever's involved, to help them just to think in a different way about it, and then implement some ideas through getting a renewable energy expert as a mentor for a couple of days to sort of help shape the thinking on how we're going to deal with the heat, the massive heat loss in certain types of community buildings.
Yeah.
And then somebody else will pop up and say, well, we can do growing in this plot of land next to the buildings, and we can start becoming a more resilient community by self-sustaining ourselves. But it does take everybody, because these things are so different. It's a little bit like, I guess, something like an allotment concept where you can't really do it all on your own. You have to have a team of people who are working together, either in volunteer ways to make progress. So in that sense, it's good because it brings this community together, which often we've become the society's become very individualistic in the way we do things, and you get out of your house, walk down the end of your garden, get into the car, and that's about as much as you happen to see your neighbour if he happens to be doing the same thing at the same time, which is like almost never.
Yeah.
So community's been lost in a real sense. We have become like a virtual sort of so-called community online Definitely. All the time, and yet we're not really interacting. And I think that's why loneliness and all kinds of other problems of poverty and this, that, and the other come more extreme because people don't know how to rely on other people.
Yeah, and I think the quality of the interaction has changed quite a lot because you're no longer looking someone in the eye when you're talking to them. You can be quite rude and you're not really... Well, you can misread things, you can deliberately misread things, you can not care or not even realise that there's a person on the other end. Yeah. And so actual real... meeting someone while you're trimming the hedge or whatever. Yeah. It's a genuine interaction.
Yeah, that's right. And community-based things will bring people together from all walks of life. So that's the beauty of it as well. You get solicitors and plumbers and electricians and barristers, and they're all mixed up together because they all kind of need each other in a way.
Yes.
In terms of a small eco community, and if you have to build in sort of long transportation commutes for certain groups of people because they can't afford to live in a certain place, or you just segregate people by the way you build the development, so and nobody else can get in. It's not a good way.
No.
To develop.
I was reading a thing a couple of years ago, which was a report into how people in the city are going to work out in the country. And the people who are buying the houses in the country are going to work in the city. And so you've got it starts the other way around. So it's, people in the city get rich, they buy their country houses, and then, that takes away the houses from all the people living in the country. So they move to the city because it's cheaper, but are commuting back. And so you've got this sort of crisscross of where people are living and where people are working, not being in the same spot. No one's getting any kind of benefit from it.
Well, that's great. That's the result of having extended suburbia going on forever, which has usually got no mixed uses in it. So there's no centres, there's no places to buy things easily. So you have to then drive into the town centre, and it becomes a commuting sort of scenario. And in America, the sprawl concept is so widespread and massive that when the same principle applies, people, what they say is you have to in order to qualify for a mortgage, you drive till you qualify. You drive out of the town centre till you get to the affordable zone that's right for you. So and that can be a long way in America because everything is so low density. So you can have a couple of hours drive in the morning and at night. And of course, you're living in quite a poor area, but your travel bills are going quite high anyway. So it's a kind of bit of a distorted economics. The amount of money you have left for your house and your home gets smaller and smaller.
So you have to go further and further out.
Yeah.
Yes. Speaking of community development, you've been involved with Poundbury, which is a thing I've only really become aware of in the last couple of years. On the Prince's Foundation, we talked about it quite a lot. Obviously, they're very, very proud of what they've done. So what was your involvement with that?
Well, my role was as the Prince's Foundation representative for Poundbury. So I my job was to take people to Poundbury and explain the principles that were behind the development from the beginning, and how they've developed over time, and what the future kind of looks like for the completed project. And It was a fascinating 3 years for me, really, because having come out from a sort of more, I guess, mainstream architectural education and background, then although for a while I've always thought about urban issues as in the background to my architectural practice, and but there it became suddenly the main thing. So I was looking at how you structure settlements for all kinds of things, like how to make active, sustainable communities that are going to be sustainable in the long term and be self-sufficient in the long term. Mm-hmm. And so I think that Poundbury was really setting that kind of model in place. And to some degree, it had the luxury of having an enlightened landowner
right. Yes.
who could take long-term decisions and say, well, I don't care what the market mass house building community are telling me, or the funding people, or the real estate properties, whatever it is, whatever industry, or the architects. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do it in a different way. And so that's what's happened.
And how is it different from? Well, for a start, it's an expansion of Winchester. Have I got that right?
No, Dorchester.
Dorchester,
yes,
the other Chester.
Yeah, well, it was a Roman town, so you got right. The origins right. Yes.
So it's an expansion of Dorchester. How big? How many?
It was about 450 acres, and it was sort of one of 3 locations around Dorset that could take the expansion needed for the county.
Right.
When the 3 areas were assessed in just general planning terms, Dorchester came up as probably the best in terms of sustainability, because the other 2 were in danger of being a bit more remote from other existing settlements, which would put them into the category of the then fashionable term eco towns or eco cities or eco settlements. But because they weren't connected, they weren't as eco as they could make themselves out to be.
Yeah.
But to extend an existing settlement and to create more walkable neighbourhoods that are connected to an existing settlement with all its infrastructure, like railways and buses and other things, obviously it ticks a lot more boxes even before you start building.
Yeah.
And there was a ring road, as is common in a lot of English towns, that went round. And quite a lot of the farmland of the duchy at that time was within on the town side of the ring road.
Right.
So it was sort of wedged in a way that wasn't making it sort of ideal for the farming community to farm properly, because you're sort of fenced in some ways. So it became kind of a logical place to build. And the Prince of Wales then decided, having seen quite a lot of duchy developments over the previous 100 years or 50 years in particular, he decided that he didn't want to do it the same way that they'd always done it, which was largely more recent times on a fairly suburban model. So he had already got thoughts that were very based in traditional architecture and natural materials and classical forms and things that were easily reproduced and built over centuries by ordinary people and ordinary builders who didn't have to have a PhD in some sort of scientific building technology in order to build the building. So there's a lot of sense in that, and but there wasn't many people around who would know how to deliver that, because the architectural profession are always literally following in the line of Le Corbusier and everything that came out of modernism from the early part of the 20th century. And whilst it's been tweaked here and there, the principle is largely the same. It's a very it was always talked of as form follows function,
right?
But in many ways, it became a stylistic thing as much as any other form of architecture. So modernism has a kind of style, and people will often argue for that modernism based on stylistic principles and very little about anything else.
So you're saying that it's form follows function. So function is primary in the modern.
In the modern architecture, form follows function. So the idea was that you however you wanted to live your life and what kind of spaces you want to occupy was so prime and important that what the end envelope of the building turned out to be wasn't important. It was just sort of the end result of all these logical steps that you'd taken. But with the skills of people like Le Corbusier and others who were quite artistic and kind of quite good at sort of organising visual things, there was a certain kind of cachet to the style and the look of the thing as well.
Yeah.
And over time, there was quite a lot of social ideas attached to early modernism as well, which were good. But as time went on, it often sort of got a little bit of an excuse to build cheaply, and we don't need to put pitched roofs on, we don't need to do this, we do it all. And the weathering characteristics of modern architecture, they have been developed over time, are not great in the northern hemisphere. If you've got something in Greece or in some other place with flat roofs and no projecting cornices here and there, somehow the rain and the weather doesn't affect the building in a terrible way. But if you're in the Northern Europe, you get streaks and staining and building failures and leaks and all kinds of stuff if you don't build it, in a proper way. So in looking for someone to deal with Poundbury, the Prince of Wales came up with Leon Creer, or he was advised that this would be a man who could understand European traditions and history and settlement patterns, and would be able to develop a master plan that would have a linking with the original sort of characteristics of sustainable, walkable neighbourhood, which was the original Roman settlement.
Right. Okay. And that walkable settlements are really, that's one of the key things that I was interested in when I first heard about it, because the streets don't have a curbed pavement, do they? And there's lots of indicators as to why you should drive slowly, but without ever telling you that you should drive slowly, and there should be a segregation between.
Exactly, yes. Well, Poundbury sort of adopted a kind of an organic approach to town planning, so that streets didn't go like on elongated, long sort of Beaux-Arts avenues forever. So you could really build up a bit of speed while you were driving down there, and then sort of go around some enormously curved bit at the end, so you could stay driving at 50 miles an hour. It decided that the sort of almost like the medieval street pattern was much more based originally on how people walked. So by having junctions that are terminated by another building or another street frontage, means you have to stop and make a decision whether to go left or right. And you take away a lot of the signage, you take away traffic lights, you take away 20, 30, 40 mile an hour signage, and you're throwing the responsibility back onto the driver of coming into your town to make his own decisions, how fast he drives, and work it out. What's the safe thing to do? And because there is a lot more uncertainty for him in that process, he will automatically slow down, because he might be thinking, well, a child could run out or something on the street. And so it does have this, it's sort of counterintuitive, isn't it? You sort of think, well, the more signage at like 20 miles an hour, the slower and safer we'll be.
Yeah.
But ironically, it doesn't do that. You put something at, say, 30 miles an hour, and somebody thinks, I can just drive 30 miles an hour regardless of what the actual conditions are like. So you're creating possibly more dangerous environment for people to walk. So Poundbury sort of pioneered this concept quite considerably, and certainly in recent times, of sharing surfaces. It's quite a trendy term now, shared surfaces in cities and towns. But at the time, there wasn't really any sort of legislation or books that you could say, well, this is how to do it. So Leon Creer, I guess, because of his great knowledge of places and in European towns and cities, which are very similar to a lot of early Anglo-Saxon settlements, on which many of our towns are based as well. He said, well, let's just look and see what happens in other places. If it works there, it can work here. And trying to argue that with the sort of road engineers and council planners is not that easy to do.
Yeah.
So he had a very persuasive and a strong sort of role at the early stages, trying to put across this new vision.
Yeah. And then has it, I've tried to describe this to various other people, this way of, slowing traffic and, making people more aware. And I think generally the response is, well, that sounds really dangerous. There's very little respect for the drivers if they're not told what to do, they won't do it. I assume, by the way you're talking about it, that it's there's been no fatalities or people being knocked down by speeding cars hasn't happened.
No, well, the last time I heard Simon Conybeare, the development director for Poundbury, talking about this, there had been no mishaps at all.
That's fantastic.
Which is surprising, because the number of people that do get knocked down by cars is quite a number. I mean, in the States, it's quite a large number, which is really worrying. But so yes, it is. It is a fact. But it does take a lot of careful design, and the master plan of Poundbury is a very sophisticated piece of work, and every corner and every sort of junction is really thought about, not just in terms of a flat plan of how the roadway intersects, but how the buildings visually present themselves at the corner. So as you're coming down, you won't see straight through. You will get a building jutting out with a window facing you, and it's sort of it's kind of a little bit more natural surveillance is going on. People are kind of looking out for each other, what's going on, and you're driving into somebody else's territory. If you're on a sort of motorway, you feel that the road is yours, and you can put your foot down. But if you change different, make things different, and plant trees in certain places. There's even a lane in Poundbury. They brought lanes back into Poundbury, into the dictionary of town planning again, which had been lost for like a century probably.
How do you mean lanes?
Well, a lane is a little
as in like an alleyway.
A little lane is a connecting route through a town or a village, which is often very nice, and mostly just the locals know about it, and it creates this subsect of walkability that gives richness and interest to a place.
Nice.
So you get hedges, you get streams, you get trees, and there is a lane in Poundbury with a tree right in the middle of the lane.
Right.
So you literally can't drive down it. You can walk or cycle down it.
Yeah.
But little things like that, and they're all subtle, but because they're built in carefully, they make a massive difference.
Fantastic. I did notice I was at just a very regular housing development just a little while ago, and I noticed that there were no pavements, and there was they'd obviously taken that idea and I don't know if they were directly influenced by Poundbury, but no pavements. Any intersections were sort of, they weren't marked out like a like a roundabout or a four-way stop. That's very American. It was just kind of left for your own.
Yes. Well, after Poundbury and one or two other things that the foundation were involved in, there was a gradual build-up of knowledge of this kind of way of doing things, and some of that information got handed down or passed on to the government, who was developing design guidance for new towns and places, and so they replaced DB32, which was an old highways design document, which had all these like big sort of arcs of how you would drive around a sort of road, and 3-point turns, and everything was based around the way the car worked. Yeah. So that started to get superseded by something called Manual for Streets. And so Manual for Streets took many of the principles that came out of Poundbury and other projects like that, and so embedded it now into design guidance for everybody. So the influence of Poundbury is quite considerable. People don't always acknowledge it, but it's definitely the fountain of many relearned ideas that have been there in the past but have been lost, and because of car domination, really.
And that's a sort of fascinating point. And so one of the sort of founding principles of this podcast is about how we use techniques from the past, with modern thinking to go forward. So certainly in Hartwyn, we use a lot of lime plaster, a lot of lath and plaster, sort of heritage techniques that they're based in sort of knowledge of materials, and we know that they last, and so that's what we're using to drive our sort of view on sustainability. It's sort of proven track record materials and techniques. So it's really interesting that the same mindset for this development.
Absolutely, and longevity is a very key part of sustainability, and a lot of products and things are now inform or are built into the built environment. Buildings are a very short length of, a warranty might be 25 years if you're lucky, or something like this, and the amount of failure that can happen or degrading of fossil fuel based materials and synthetic materials is quite significant. And the way that some of the insulation boards have been used over time has created condensation within the structures of existing buildings.
Yeah.
Because of the way it doesn't allow airflow and it traps moisture in the buildings. So there's quite a lot of rethinking at the moment on from the mainstream insulation industry, how you do that, because a lot of people have been insulating from the inside.
Yeah.
And this has been causing lots of problems, and lots of claims have been coming out as a result of this. And it really goes back to the idea that we should be building it with breathable materials and breathing, allowing the whole structure to breathe and become like a sort of combined piece of thermal mass that heats and cools at a certain, much more slowly than when you have very thin materials that heat up and then have to be cooled down, and then you're relying on air conditioning and such like to mitigate these extremes. So you start relying much more on technology in that sense.
I think, breathable is sort of the term that's often used, but I think it's somehow quite misleading. I think what we're really talking about is moisture permeable, isn't it? It's not, because I think breathable gives the feeling like it's full of holes, like you could breathe through it.
Yes.
And I actually just got a specification from an architect the other day that said, because the buildings are breathable, it means that the air can flow through them. It's like, well, it's not the air that flows through them; it's the moisture. If the air flowed through them, then you'd have drafts, and it wouldn't be an effective.
Yes, I mean, obviously, like aerated clay block is quite full of air. It's a lot of clay, but it's a lot of air.
Yeah.
So it is about the moisture penetration, allowing the moisture to come in and to go out, and not to be trapped.
Yeah.
And allowing that freedom of movement. But it does obviously affect the internal air quality quite significantly, because then you don't get that musty, horrible, dank feeling when air can't when a place can't breathe properly.
Yes. Yeah, I think what had happened with this, the architect who'd specified this thing, I think they'd confused ventilation and breathability as kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
So by specifying a breathable material, they,
Yes, it's quite complex depending on if you're dealing with existing buildings or dealing with new. If you're dealing with new, it's quite easy. It's much easier to, from first principles, set out the breathable principles of the whole structure. But often in existing buildings, you might get sort of timber boarding over the rafters, which might have been treated in some way, sort of thereby making them quite impermeable.
Yeah.
So if you then put insulation up to the underside of that and fill up the gap in between all the joists, you're going to get also interstitial condensation, even with a natural product.
Yeah.
So you still have to be careful to incorporate ventilation in those circumstances, like a slot of ventilation, so that it can come in at the eaves and it can exit at the top of the building somehow.
Yeah.
Because traditionally, I guess a lot of old buildings just did not have insulation.
Not unless they were thatched.
They had just huge fires, and they wore a lot of clothes.
Yeah.
But of course, people, the thatch is the exception to that, isn't it? They thought, well, let's have insulation rather than really think on the roof.
Did they think that, or did they think weve got loads of straw left over? Let's bung it on the roof, and
then they thought, oh, it's nice and warm in here.
What a happy coincidence.
Yes. It often things happen like that. I think even Poundbury started off as being something that would be quite a nice classical, nice look architecturally, but actually it turned out in many ways to be an exercise in sustainability in quite an extreme way.
Were the houses built of the aerated clay block? in Poundbury?
Some no, I think there are some aerated clay block, and there are some other forms of timber framing and insulation. But I think in the early days when Poundbury was first built, no one really knew about all these new technologies or hadn't really developed them very well, like natural building technologies have really pioneered wood fibre insulation. And it's been used in Germany and Switzerland for quite a long time. And so it's kind of mainstream here, but it's all still new here. So trying to get it through the standard forms of construction and management and building regulations takes quite an effort. But I think that is changing. Passive house standards have sort of tended to question a lot of things as well. Yeah. And the Code for Sustainable Homes for a while had quite a stream of projects that were pushing the agenda in lots of different ways and learning at the same time. So it's kind of different now. So I think the houses that are building now are probably much more sustainable in terms of the actual building fabric than they might have been, 20 years ago.
Yeah. I had, just outside my studio in Bristol, there's a little, I think there's student houses going up. And, first of all, the speed at which they went up was phenomenal. They're all timber framed. But then I noticed that, they're all wrapped and taped and, infill insulation. And it's made me sort of question, it's always been a question in my mind, but the tapes, like you were talking about earlier about the sort of warranties and how long the product's going to last. Like, how long is that tape going to last? And as soon as that tape degrades, you've just got a massive air gap, and then you've got very short-lived housing that's going to be useless very, very quickly. Yeah, I didn't have an actual question from that.
No, it's true. It's true. You can do things more or less, say, sustainably, but still rely on certain technologies that hold it all together. Like air tightness, for instance. Taping up all the joints and potential gaps and everywhere is a good thing. But how long does the tape adhere to those materials? And I know there are a lot of good products available, but once they break down, you got to consider, what happens then? Will it still be airtight or not? And I guess when you're designing houses or buildings, if you can find the way to connect building materials together in a way that naturally sort of seals things in the right way or connects insulation with insulation or with the frame or whatever it is, without the reliance. I mean, when for instance, mastic came out, everybody sort of was using everywhere, it's like the answer to everything. Like bad building techniques, mastic, and of course it breaks down after a while. And then you end up with leaking windows and sills and roofs and everything, because this has got quite a short time frame before it sort of falls apart, especially when it's subject to heat and cold of winter and summer and winter. So to rely on such sort of synthetic materials is still a bad idea, even when you're building sustainable buildings.
Yes, I was talking to someone the other day who said that the PVC windows, when they were sort of rolled out for sustainability purposes, what they didn't do was install them properly. So they got a nice, more insulative window with loads of gaps around the outside, which is probably worse than the single pane windows that they replaced.
Yes.
And actually a net sort of loss in efficiency.
Exactly. Most air loss is through the gaps between construction, not the actual construction itself, even if it's single or, early double glazed units. I mean, it's still always how it connects around the edges. Yeah. And if you look at traditional buildings, of course, the outer brick leaf tends to sort of project forward in front of the window frames. Yeah. And the vertical sliding sash mechanisms are well embedded in the building, in the construction. So as long as you can, if you do a few things like that, then the amount of wind and rain that's going to get to those joints is going to be reduced quite a bit. Yeah,
and there's a sort of set distance back, isn't there, that is optimal. I seem to remember hearing once that maybe it's a bit of research that BRE did, that if you set the window back too far, then you create too much of a dead space and you get damp on the windows. But if you don't set it back at all, then it's right kind of in the wind zone, and so all the air pushes through. So there's that sort of optimum. I think it's about 100 mil.
Yes. Yes. Well, that probably coincides a bit with the regulations that came after the Great Fire of London in 1666 as well, because it was a fire issue as well. Oh, really? Fire on the outside was leaping up from one floor to another, and the Queen Anne windows were right on the surface of the building, so there was hardly any depth at all. Right. So it was easier for that to happen. So after the rebuilding after the fire, they set them back at the minimum of 100 millimeters, so that it just made that less likely.
So you were involved in the Prince's Foundation building craft apprenticeship. Is that right?
Yes, I was. I led one or two. I led two, I think. One while I was working in the foundation, and one later when I was working in my own practice. Yeah. The first one was at Poundbury, and that was an educational program where it brings together people who are training to be professionals in the built environment industry. So that could be people wanting to be planners, policymakers, or architects, and on the other hand, they bring together people who are doing crafts skills. So people might be doing stonemasonry, some people might be doing timber framing, and they brought them together to plan out a project in Poundbury that would have to use all of their skills to communicate these two groups of people that don't normally communicate in a very easy way.
Notoriously, there's a notorious disconnect between the two.
There is.
And the builders, us, will tend to go, "Oh, those architects," and wave their fists. And I think it's probably the same the other way around, isn't it? It's a fantastic program. I was, I think I'm registered as the only earth builder they've ever had on the Prince's Foundation apprenticeship program. Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating thing. So there's the 3 week. Was that still the case when you did it, or you did it?
I was involved. Yes, the first one in Poundbury was a shorter length of time. It was a summer school, right? So everybody was together on the site, looking at different aspects of the geography, and then we had a workshop that everybody came together to think through how it was going to be planned and designed. And that was that was a lot of drawing work, and some of the crafts guys found that quite difficult because a lot of them were very good at making timber joints and thinking through things in their head and then just building it. Yeah. And the architects couldn't deal with that, or the planners. They had to draw it first and get it right and get the dimensions correct. Yeah. In order to sort of communicate or understand what it was they were doing. And of course, on these projects, you then get to the point where you have to have it signed off by somebody. Who signs it off? Often, it's the architect on one hand, but you also need the structural engineer. Yeah. And this is where you get into a little bit of conflict, because a traditional craftsman is somebody who's based his ideas on tradition, on things always having been done in a certain way for centuries. Yeah. Therefore, why do you need some engineer to come and verify what he's done, which for like 200 or 300 years has always worked perfectly? Yeah. So there was absolute stand-up rows in some of the workshops that we went to when we were dealing with the master craftsmen, and walking out and slamming doors. I mean, it was bizarre. Just on a small project in Poundbury, it was really, really an eye-opener for me. But there are people who, they have this long tradition, and it's almost medieval, and it still kind of exists. And that was a surprise. But equally, the engineers had to then figure out how they're going to do calculations on joints they've never seen before, and timber sections that don't seem to, In actual fact, most of the time, the whole thing was probably quite over-engineered in terms of the way the craftsman does it. So it would stand a hurricane, it would be so well-founded and, developed. So I don't think there was a worry, but he still had to perhaps run some calculations on a machine, on a computer to demonstrate to himself and his professional indemnity insurance providers that, he was doing his job,
And I suppose we look and sort of say, people, back in the past knew how to do the, timber framing, and they knew the right size timbers and stuff. But then we only get to see the ones that have survived. So perhaps there were people building, really sort of with sticks that they've just collapsed. And so, we do have that proven track record of, these buildings have stood for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
We know these timber sizes are, adequate.
Yes, and I think also now when you overlay on that now the requirements for sort of insulation and heat loss and efficiencies in those ways, it tends to have other aspects of the building that will inevitably change in order to meet those targets. So bits and pieces have to be adapted from the traditions to take account of that. And I think with Poundbury, the one we did there was a youth shelter just on the edge of the settlement near the oval cricket ground.
Right.
Just far enough for the young people to not feel like their parents are overlooking them too much, but not too far away to get into like heavy drugs or something. Right. Like that. It was just like a well sort of calibrated sort of position in the master plan. But with that, predominantly the design was of a historic and a traditional nature, so it was mainly in that field. When we came a year or two later to do a performance stage structure at the National Botanic Gardens of Wales, that was very different because somehow the guys who had been designing in the workshop, the ideas that took precedence that came from the architects,
right?
Somehow. And the geometry that they came up with was not, whilst looking traditional, was not actually quite as traditional as it appeared.
Right.
And trying to then, my job as an architect was trying to sort of take these ideas and make them work. And it didn't really work from a sort of straightforward traditional timber jointing, framing point of view.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the engineer came in because he saw that there was a bit of a conundrum in how we would develop that. And he started to say, well, what we could be looking at here is a cooperative structure. Now, that's very different. The cooperative structure is where every piece of timber within the construction has a role to play that's almost equal in terms of its structural capacity.
Okay.
With traditional timber frame buildings, it's much more what you call a hierarchical organization of forces.
Yeah.
So you get some really big trusses that take huge amounts of the weight, and that goes on to some big piers that are positioned in certain places or like columns. And then there's very, very secondary structure that's much smaller and lighter and takes a lot less weight, but that finds its way onto these bigger structures. So it's a hierarchy of sort of support coming down to like these huge columns that support it at the bottom. So it was a different way of thinking, and it was a mind bender completely for the poor old timber framer, because he had to then think, well, he's got to cut this incredible ring beam, but it's going to have a lot of structural members coming down sort of equally all the way around it that go up to a kind of spire at the top, a square spire that the architect had
right.
The young apprentice or graduate fellow had sort of come up with and drawn very nicely. So we all had a dickens of a job trying to sort of work between these two very, very different traditions. One being the sort of mainstream professional consultancy of an engineering practice, and the other being the traditional timber framing world, and it somehow had to work, and somehow it worked. And he actually, the engineer came up with a very sophisticated three-dimensional model to show how this cooperative structure actually would work. But in the end, it was built by craftsmen cutting these huge, enormous pieces of timber to make the ring beam, and then all of the other structures that sort of piled up on top of it. So I realised then in both of those projects there is quite a big gap and a very hard bridge to jump between the two. You either, to make life simple, you either go the full engineering route, mainstream engineering, all on computer, or you go fully into the craftsman traditions and stick with it. So, I mean, I think there is a case of bringing them together for lots of different reasons, but it just requires quite a lot of thought, and I think there's a lot of thinking going on in the building industry, and indeed ought to, in order to make buildings much more sustainable for the 21st century.
Yeah.
Learning from the past, but also learning the best things from things we've discovered in the 20th century.
Yeah. I was reading your blog this morning, and I was fascinated by the phrase, 100 years ago we had 55 building products. And now, what was it? You estimated it?
I think it's like a sort of 155,000 or something like it. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And so, well, I mean, it sort of goes into what we were just saying, that, if one of those materials is wood, then, you've got all this knowledge of what's succeeded and what's failed. And so you've got that known entity. Whereas now, because we don't have proven track records of 155,000 different materials, we just have to model them and calculate them and make sure we're being safe. And
well, so it's very difficult, really. If a fairly new product is on the market, it's not got a track record, so it will give you a warranty of maybe 5-10 years or something like this, but who knows? I mean, it's a little bit test it and see, really, and I think that's why probably
over-engineer it and see.
Over-engineer it, yeah, or take out sort of expensive warranties that cover you and the clients and everybody else on top of your professional indemnity. So the whole thing becomes a bit of a kind of insurance nightmare. Adding to the costs, and
So he's sort of come up a few times. The Prince of Wales is he's obviously is he the founder of the Prince's Foundation, or the is it the patron, or the what do you?
Yes, he's a patron of about I think it was around about 20 charities. I don't know if it's the same now, but I was there a few years back. But he founded pretty much all of them, one way or the other. Obviously, the Duchy of Cornwall has gone on for centuries, since the Black Prince in 1347 or whenever it was. But he started something like a drawing school for architects in the early days, and to try and sort of get architects to actually draw with pencils and observe and look at things and appreciate traditional architecture once more. So a lot of people went through that school. It was quite influential in many ways. I mean, a lot of people I know now had some connection with that.
Right.
I didn't do that, but I came to it a lot later when I joined the Prince's Foundation for the built environment when I joined, and now it's become for building communities. So the emphasis has slightly changed, but. So he is the patron of the Prince's Foundation, who then acts as a kind of educational explainer for what's happening in Poundbury and other aspects of the principles that go behind what the Prince of Wales is trying to promote.
And it's interesting that he's been championing organic food for since the 80s or something, isn't it? And I think a lot of people initially sort of wrote it off as a bit of a sort of nonsense fad. And now suddenly, we've all caught up and gone like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And it seems like, he's actually really quite forward thinking in terms of, the sustainability, the community stuff. And that, again, we're starting to catch up, or, modern thinking is starting to catch up with his sort of premonitions almost. Premonitions probably not the right word, but
he's I think he's learnt on the job, really. I mean, if you're a big landowner, effectively, and you're doing a bit of farming anyway, and you're building buildings, and you're doing all kinds of other things, developing things, you have quite a big perspective of the whole environment and everything that sort of goes to operate and make it work. And obviously, as a Prince of Wales position, you're travelling all over the world as well.
Getting to see
and you're seeing an awful lot of things, and he's probably shaken more hands with more people than just about anyone in the world, I think, by a mile. I'm sure about that. Except maybe the Queen.
Yeah.
But it you know, obviously some of that rubs off on you, and you think to yourself when you come back to Dorset or Dorchester or Cornwall or wherever, you think, well, maybe we can put some of these thoughts into practice rather than just sort of treating them as some nice sort of touristic kind of experience, you know. And he's done that in an amazing way. I mean, it's incredible how he has collated knowledge and information and then brought it together in a project which then, you know, for better or worse in different ways as you're learning on the job, you apply these things, and lo and behold, it becomes like a leading sort of influencer in the whole of the way in which master planning and the built environment is now organised. And a lot of people would still deny that position, probably, a lot of architects, because of the reliance on traditional architecture as the sort of principle behind building a settlement in the 21st century. But there's no denying it. It is, I think, by a mile, must be one of the most successful sustainable communities in the UK because of the way in which, say, mixed uses has been integrated from the beginning. So pubs, you know, the first pub, I think, in a housing estate in England for a long time, the Poet Laureate, and a village hall that was planned. And Leon Creer had sort of worked out what all the mixed uses would be from the very beginning. And he put them all in the master plan. So the housing kind of had to fit in between all the mixed uses rather than like just having a mass house builder just produce lots of building products all over the shop with no differentiation or, you know, relief. And so this was very forward thinking. And now I think at this point, I'm not sure exactly of the numbers, but there's about 2,000 people living there, and there's about 2,000 jobs. It might be a little bit more or less. Now, that's remarkable to have a community that can function. And the pub, when I was doing a film there once with Dan Cruikshank, I managed to somehow persuade him to walk around talking while we went, and we filmed him. And it was amazing. And the pub owner said that if you want to do business, then come and live in Poundbury, because it's just so many people doing so many things, and there's little business centres, and there's medical practitioners, and there's Dorset cereals, and there's a chocolate factory, and there's a sort of there's a college of building. I mean, it's all in this place. And to do that, you had to really think differently. You, because of the way we've segregated ideas in the 20th century and zoned everything. Everything's in a separate zone. You never bring things together in this way. It's far too complicated for average professionals to get their heads around in the way that they've been educated, including architects. So it is a phenomenally advanced thinking place. And I would take people, there was about 30,000 people every year, and it may be more or less now, I don't know, but that used to come and see Poundbury.
Just to visit?
Just to visit from around the world. And not all me, but the Duchy of Cornwall took a lot of people around as well, and so did the Prince's Foundation. And I was surprised often to have people like, you know, the town, the city of Malmo, you know, in Sweden, coming to see what's going on in Poundbury. I'm thinking they're supposed to be like the kind of like really cool edge of like sustainability in the world, and everybody goes there. But they were coming to Poundbury and almost like bypassing any sort of architectural sort of profession in this country to do something that they would never do, and that's to learn from a successful place. And what they said was they'd done all the sort of smart, super projects on the waterfront, all very glamorous. But like 90% of the country is still ordinary communities, and we've got to address that. We don't really know how to do it, so we've got to find somewhere that has kind of, you know, set the standard. So they came to Poundbury. So things like that, and you know, I had sort of stand up sort of arguments in some cases with a bunch of like Dutch architects came to visit Poundbury once, and they were intent on sort of pulling it down, you know. And myself and a colleague, Lucian Stell who's now working for the University of Notre Dame in America.
Right.
But he and I were just sat at the front, having all these questions shot at us, and we were just defending it to the hilt. It was quite funny in Brownswood Hall. This great community centre right in the centre of Poundbury.
Yeah. Before I'd been and before I knew too much about it, I'd heard mixed reviews of people that didn't really get it, and I think someone called it a toy town. Didn't really see the benefit of the why it was different. But I mean, certainly talking to you, it seems like it's a success. Is it largely a success? Is it?
Oh, I would say
wholly.
I would say pretty wholly a success. Now, you might not like some of the expressions architecturally, and that's fair enough. I mean, it is a little bit of an anomaly, really, when you see that we've had to go back so far in history to make something that's sort of sidestepped the kind of cul-de-sac we've got into with modern development. I mean, people are now sort of looking at the principles, and they're trying to apply it in different ways, using different architectural forms and more modern forms, and I think that's fair enough. I mean, the big thing, I think, is understanding the need for a language.
Yeah.
A language of architecture. Now, within a language, as in Poundbury, there's a multitude of different versions and variety.
Yeah.
And often when you're sort of coding or developing ideas for a place like this, you're putting sort of design codes in place to create variety rather than to stymie variety to stop it, because a lot of housing estates have got no variety at all. It's just constant sort of repetition of the same model, more or less. Now that's probably changing now. So yes, but I mean, you have to see Poundbury as a big experiment of its day, and its massive contribution. And there are parts of Poundbury, I would say, that you would probably say, well, they could have done better on this part of it in terms of the architectural layout and the building configuration. Usually there's not a lot wrong with the master plan because it's been so well done. It's sometimes the delivery of the building projects themselves and a little bit more of a loose handle on what should be happening, or a little bit of lack of confidence in one kind of approach or another. But overall, I would say there's a lot to learn from it. So it's a dangerous thing to write it off because of you don't like the architecture. And sometimes you can say, this is a bit flowery, or this is a bit over the top. You can sort of say, why do we have to sort of replicate classicism quite so strictly? Yeah. But on the other hand, when you see people's attempts to try and do it, and a lot of builders do a sort of what you could say a fake version of tradition. Yeah. People say Poundbury can be fake, but if you see what a better builder's version of tradition is, you know that it really is terrible, So, I mean, I think you've got to look really as authentically as you can at the building construction. If you look at the quality of the brickwork and you look at the different forms of brick coursing that you can have, the variety, you look at the quality of the windows and how they're set back in the right way, and the frames and the eaves. There are sort of quite strong principles that need to be carried through, I think, in most developments, and maybe you don't put the classical bits on sometimes. I mean, I think, but you do need to consider, well, how do we get the detail that relate to ordinary people who just like to see detail? I mean, as you get closer to a classical building, your appreciation of its architectural significance changes. First of all, you're seeing a total classical design proportioning, which is quite a big scale.
When you say classical, what does that mean?
Well, in England, we've always had this classical tradition that goes back to, I don't know, 16th century or earlier. Inigo Jones, who was Welshman, by the way, he did the grand tour and came back and built a few classical buildings based on what he'd seen of Palladio's work in Italy. And that was a very simple form of, a pitched roof, square building, and a few pilasters on the front. Yeah. and it took off in this country. So classical has got quite a long tradition here. Christopher Wren and all of those. It's a harmonic proportioning of big buildings, and often the columns are sort of trying to adjust the scale of a building to the city scale. Mm-hmm. So you might have 2 or 3 floors behind the columns,
right?
And maybe on a small house you just have the columns around the front door as you go in. But it's a way of adjusting scale. And a lot of modern buildings don't have that. They have this continuous sort of graph paper regularity that goes from the pavement to the roof.
Yeah.
No differentiation, no hierarchy, no sort of change of scale. So as you get to it, it's the same as it was when you're like 10 miles away. Mm-hmm. Nothing changes; it just gets bigger. Whereas a classical building, you start to appreciate different levels of detail as you walk closer and closer to the building. So there's or not just classical, it could be, traditional barn or a traditional brick building, vernacular buildings that don't have any of the those kind of frills, but have enough detail just to allow that human appreciation at street level when you're walking by and you say, wow, it's amazing stonework. I just really love that. It's just so cool, rather than just like panels and panels of more glass and, cementitious kind of material.
Great. Well, Noel, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me. No. And thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Well then, Joe, what do you think of that?
It's great. I'd heard bits and pieces about Poundbury and had always liked the idea. So I think getting into it much more thoroughly, it was really great. I really enjoyed hearing about the kind of really in-depth design process that obviously went into it. I think it's wonderful that there exists in England in a modern day a town that's been built for people. And that works for people.
The human scale, not the automobile scale.
Absolutely. I just think that's a wonderful thing, and I now have to go and visit.
It's interesting. I've never actually been, and anyone I've spoken to about it sort of went, "Oh, it's like a little joke town. It's sort of toy town. It's it was a complete failure. All this sort of stuff."
What?
And I've seen the architecture now. I've looked it up, and it is. I mean, it's a style which I don't think many people would necessarily kind of connect with.
Right.
It's it's very classical, as Noel said, and it's it's a certain aesthetic, which is obviously Prince Charles's his thing, and but in terms of what it's seemingly given to sort of how housing developments and how settlements are planned, it seems like it was a massive success.
Yeah, well, I think that's the key to take, isn't it? And I think that Noel was trying to make that point, that it doesn't really matter what the individual architecture looks like, and that people were getting lost in the critique of the aesthetic, which was the secondary point to it. The kind of main driving force seemed to be how can we place things? How do we order a civilization, a kind of a collection of buildings? How do we do that in a way that is sympathetic and enjoyable, and takes some of the guessing and the rules out of life because of the way you have to maneuver yourself through it? I just thought that was really that to me is the essence of good design. It's when things happen unconsciously.
Yeah, you don't need a manual to say this is how you do it.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that fascinated me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I particularly like the talk about the lane, the bringing back the lane, some of the tree right in the middle of it, so that there's no way traffic could go down it or reclaim it.
Yeah, I
just really like that, bringing nature in, acknowledging that that's something that we need, building it into the plan rather than as an afterthought. Yeah, really good.
Nice. Well, is there anything else we wanted to talk about before we leave the good podcast people?
I think so.
I want to say a massive thank you to Earth Building UK and Ireland.
Oh, yes.
For Clayfest last weekend.
Yeah.
Weekend before. It's an event showcasing all the possibilities of clay-based building. So that's cob and clay plasters and earth floors and all that kind of exciting stuff. we went down with all but one of our students,
Yeah.
and everyone learnt loads and loads and got hands on and practical and was making these shiny clay balls.
Oh, the polished Japanese balls.
Yes.
Yeah, they looked great. They all came back polishing them.
Yeah.
And Jodie made an amazing rammed earth arch.
Yeah, so that's our apprentice,
Oh.
who had never done rammed earth before. And she went straight in at like master level and did a vault.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, very, very proud of her.
Yeah. That was great. Great experience for the guys. And really good job from Earth Building UK and Ireland, and marvellously hosted by Kat.
Centre for Alternative Technology.
Yeah, brilliant. Always putting on really great events. Always lots to learn. So, yeah, well done, everyone.
Yeah. So before we go, just the final thing is to say that if you're enjoying these podcasts, do get on and subscribe. If you're on iTunes, hit the subscribe button. And if you're really loving it, give us a 5-star review.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it helps us be seen by more people.
That's what we want.
Cool. All right. See you next month.
Bye.
Bye.